I couldn't answer how often. I suppose I think about it quite a bit, like everybody else. I think we're all conscious that this life is very temporary and it's very short. The older you get, the shorter it seems.
In the cold quiet of a North Carolina mountain morning on the 21st of February 2018, the voice that had called millions to faith fell silent forever. Billy Graham died at 7:46 with only a nurse present, and his doctor later said he simply wore out. Yet behind that peaceful ending were years of isolation, deep depression after Ruth's death, and unresolved family tensions. Their shared calling carried a far heavier cost than public tributes ever revealed. The morning he finally wore out. Franklin Graham had driven up the mountain only days earlier on the Sunday before that final morning. His father had grown quieter in those last years and spoke very little, even when his mind remained clear enough to respond. That Sunday, Billy's hand shook from the cold, and Franklin brought a blanket and settled it carefully around his chest and neck. Within a few minutes, the shaking stopped, and Billy drifted into a light sleep. Franklin prayed over him and left the house knowing he would return the following week the way he always did. He would later say that was the last time he saw his father alive. When the call came on the 21st of February, Franklin was in Dallas, and the news reached him through a longtime assistant. The nurse alone in the house at Little Piney Cove confirmed the exact time of death, and the physician who arrived 20 minutes later described a passing free of any crisis or uncontrolled pain. Billy Graham had simply worn out after 99 years of a life that had once filled stadiums across the world. The public honors that followed stood in sharp contrast to the isolation of those final hours. His body was moved with care and eventually lay in honor at the United States Capitol Rotunda, making him the fourth private citizen and the first religious leader given that recognition. A private family prayer service took place, and the closed casket was viewed at the restored family home place on the grounds of the Billy Graham Library. On the 2nd of March, 2018, the funeral service filled a tent at the library, and he was buried beside Ruth in the prayer garden at the foot of a cross-shaped walkway. The simple plywood casket had been made by inmates at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, and the prisoners' names were burned into the wood with a wooden cross fixed to the lid. His grave marker carried only the words, "Preacher of the Gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ." Daughter Ruth said the day of Billy's passing felt glorious because he was finally reunited with his wife. Anne Graham Lotz believed the timing held deeper meaning, yet the private reality was quieter. For years, Billy had lived withdrawn, rarely seeing visitors, often drifting in and out of consciousness as the mountain house remained still around him. The man who once spoke to millions now lived in silence, leaving a profound emptiness that faith could comfort, but never fully erase. I keep returning to that detail of Franklin placing the blanket and watching the shaking stop, because it feels like the last small act of ordinary care in a life that had been anything but ordinary. The isolation of that final morning did not arrive without warning. It grew out of the long depression that settled over Billy after Ruth died and the years of physical decline that slowly closed the world around him, the years of quiet grief that preceded it. After Ruth's death in 2007, Billy experienced a depression that lasted roughly 2 years, according to their daughter Ruth. He spoke of the shock of loss, even though he had prepared for it as carefully as anyone could. He found himself wanting to pick up the phone to call her, and then remembering with a fresh wave of realization that he could not. Sudden memories would rise without warning and leave him almost overwhelmed. He kept favorite photographs of her on his desk and returned again and again to the Christian hope of reunion while still feeling as though a central part of himself had been taken away. In one interview, he admitted that no matter how ready he thought he was, the grief remained very real and at times nearly crushing. Grief is a demanding guest in an old man's house, and it does not leave simply because the person who remains believes in heaven. After Ruth's death, the mountain home that had once reflected their quiet companionship became a place of memories. Billy remained at Little Piney Cove as his health steadily declined. Parkinson's-like symptoms, prostate cancer, worsening vision and hearing, balance problems, and repeated pneumonia gradually ended his public ministry. Following his final major crusade in New York in 2005, he withdrew completely, spending his last months too weak for visitors or conversation. Daughter Ruth later recalled that in those later years her father spent many days sleeping and was not really with them in the way he once had been. He himself had said most of his life had already been lived, and that he would be glad when the Lord called him home, because he sometimes grew tired of the body that no longer served him. The depression after losing Ruth lifted somewhat with time and faith, yet the quiet never fully left the house. You know the feeling when someone remains physically present while something essential has already departed. That was the atmosphere that surrounded Billy in the years between her death and his own, and it is the kind of atmosphere that can change the people who live inside it. The children who visited carried their own complicated mix of love and residual distance, and the house itself seemed to hold the weight of both the global ministry and the private absences that had made that ministry possible. Those years of grief and withdrawal pointed back with painful clarity to the afternoon when Ruth herself left the shared life they had built over nearly 64 years. The afternoon she left him behind. Ruth Bell Graham died at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the 14th of June, 2007, at the couple's home, Little Piney Cove in Montreat. She was 87 years old. Billy and all 5 of their children stood at her bedside in the room she had occupied for so long. Family members read scripture and sang hymns including "Great is Thy Faithfulness," the same hymn that had accompanied so many of Billy's crusades. Billy leaned over and kissed her cheek and her forehead. They struggled through the doxology together, their voices uneven with the effort of the moment. The cat that had been kept away for months was finally allowed to curl up beside her, and a fire was lit in her fireplace, the way she had always liked it. The ordinary details of that room, the fire, the cat, the familiar hymn made the ending feel both intimate and final at the same time. Her final months had been marked by pneumonia, layered on top of years of physical struggle. She celebrated her 87th birthday on the 10th of June, still alert enough to receive family visits and to take in the presence of the people she loved. Shortly afterward, the feeding tube that had sustained her dislodged while she was shifting in bed. At her request, and after careful consultation with the family, it was not replaced for nutrition. Only pain medication continued. On the 13th of June, she slipped into a semi-coma and died the following day, surrounded by those closest to her. Billy called her his soulmate and best friend, saying their love had deepened with age. He later shared that after more than 65 years together, he loved her even more than when they first met. The public memorial service took place on the 16th of June at Anderson Auditorium at the Montreat Conference Center. Private interment followed the next day at the Billy Graham Library. The same simple plywood casket made by Angola inmates received her body, and the prisoners' names burned into the wood traveled with her to the prayer garden. For Billy, the shock of her absence settled in quickly, even though her decline had been long and visible. The house that had held their partnership now held only the memory of her presence and the beginning of the depression that would shape the next 2 years of his life. I think about how many people have stood in a similar room watching someone they love choose the moment to stop fighting, and how that choice can feel both like a mercy and like a permanent silence that changes every room in the house afterward. The decision about where she would be buried had already forced old family tensions into the open in the months before that afternoon, and those tensions carried the weight of decades. The burial decision that exposed old fractures. Ruth had preferred burial at the Cove, the mountain retreat near their home where she had raised the children, and where the landscape itself felt familiar and quiet. At one point, she signed a notarized statement with 6 witnesses present, declaring that under no circumstances was she to be buried in Charlotte. She described elements of the planned visitor experience at the Billy Graham Library as a circus or tourist attraction, and she wanted no part of resting in a place that felt designed more for visitors than for the people who had lived the life. Son Ned and others supported her preference with real conviction, while son Franklin, who led the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, favored the library grounds for visibility and for the continuity of the ministry that had defined their father's work. In the spring of 2007, after prayer and discussion, Billy and Ruth jointly decided on the library prayer garden at the foot of a cross-shaped walkway. Billy announced the decision publicly shortly before her death, and both would rest there in the end. The compromise settled the public matter, yet it left private tensions visible and unresolved in the way family compromises often do. The long pattern of absences, the different visions of legacy, and the question of whose wishes would finally prevail all surfaced in the months when Ruth's strength was already fading. Ned continued to hold the earlier notarized statement, even after the joint decision, and the existence of that paper became a quiet marker of the fracture. The burial site became the clearest point of family friction around their endings, and it revealed how the costs of the public calling had shaped the private relationships inside the family for decades. You can feel the weight of that kind of disagreement when it arrives at the end of a long life, because it forces everyone to confront the things that were never fully said while there was still time. Those costs reached back through the years of separation that defined so much of their marriage and the lives of their 5 children in ways that still surface in interviews and private reflections. The absences that shaped every child. Ruth raised the 5 children largely on her own, while Billy traveled for weeks or months at a time, and sometimes for half a year or longer. She framed the separations for the children as temporary and purposeful, telling them Daddy would be home in a month and keeping them focused on the larger work of telling people about Jesus. Behind that framing, she experienced real loneliness and periods of depression as a young mother managing energetic children in a house that often felt too quiet when he was gone. Journals from the 1950s show chaotic mornings filled with the ordinary noise of childhood and her own retreats to bed with her Bible when the weight of it became too much. She once read a letter from a missionary claiming it must be glamorous to be the wife of a famous evangelist, and the thought that rose in her was simple and sharp. At least that woman was with her husband. The children later spoke of feeling the distance and of not always recognizing their father after long trips when he returned looking older or more tired than the picture they held in their minds. Several of the adult children experienced divorces and other personal struggles while still affirming their parents' love and their own continued involvement in faith and ministry. Daughter Ruth has spoken openly of the serious depression that followed the discovery of her first husband's long-running affair, the dark thoughts that came with that betrayal, and of a disastrous 5-week rebound marriage that ended when she fled and drove 2 days to reach her parents' home in Montreat. She found her father waiting in the driveway. He wrapped his arms around her and said, "Welcome home," with no blame and no shame. And that moment of unconditional acceptance became a turning point she has returned to again and again in interviews because it showed her something of grace in the most personal form. Billy himself later expressed regret that some of the travel had been unnecessary and that the time away from family could never be recovered no matter how many crusades succeeded. The absences were not sudden revelations tied only to the deaths. They were long-standing dynamics that shaped the emotional landscape of the household for decades, and that left marks the children carried into their own adult lives. If you have ever grown up with a parent whose work required constant absence, you know how love and distance can exist in the same house at the same time, and how the children learn to carry both without always knowing how to name the cost. The pattern of separation grew directly out of the partnership Billy and Ruth built from the beginning, and that partnership was both the strength and the source of the weight they carried. The partnership built on sacrifice. They met as students at Wheaton College in the fall of 1940. Billy was 21, still rough around the edges, and working part-time hauling furniture when his friend Johnny Streeter pointed out Ruth Bell, the daughter of Presbyterian medical missionaries who had been raised largely in China. Billy was immediately struck by her and felt certain he was out of her league. It took him a full month to find the courage to ask her to a campus performance of Handel's Messiah. After the concert, they walked in the snow and had tea, and that night Ruth returned to her room, knelt, and prayed that if she could spend her life serving God with this man, it would be the greatest privilege she could imagine. She had long felt a call to missionary work in Tibet and was not looking for romance of any kind. Billy proposed before leaving for preaching in Florida in the summer of 1941. Ruth struggled with the decision and prayed through the uncertainty and eventually wrote her acceptance. There were later moments of hesitation on her side when the pull of the mission field returned, yet she ultimately concluded the relationship was of the Lord. They married on the 13th of August, 1943, in Montreat, shortly after graduating from Wheaton. Ruth later said she had no regrets about setting Tibet aside, because the political situation would have forced her out within a few years anyway, and she gained a lifetime of partnership, 5 children, and the work they shared. From the start, the marriage was structured around Billy's call to evangelism. He made clear that preaching came first, and Ruth accepted that reality as her own calling to free him for the work, raise the children, manage the home, and serve as his closest confidant and spiritual counselor. She always called him Bill, never the public name the world used. She supplied sermon illustrations, sharpened his writing, and kept him grounded with humor and directness when the pressures of fame threatened to distort his focus. When rumors circulated that he might run for political office, she told him the country would not elect a divorced president, and that if he left the ministry for politics, he would have a divorce on his hands. She once kicked him under the table at a dinner with President Johnson to remind him to stay with moral and spiritual counsel rather than drift into political advice. Billy came to rely on her heavily and said she was the only person in whom he completely confided, and that her counsel and prayer were his mainstay through the decades. In later years, after the children were grown and health issues limited travel, their relationship deepened into a quieter companionship centered on prayer, scripture, and simple presence. Billy spoke of rekindling the romance of their youth and of loving her more as the years passed. Ruth was never the passive figure some people imagined when they looked at the public image of the evangelist's wife. She had a sharp, dry wit and was known for pranks that kept the household from taking itself too seriously. When asked if she had ever considered divorce, she answered with characteristic directness that she had never considered divorce, but she had considered murder. The partnership was durable and faith-driven, yet both of them paid personal prices for the scale of the ministry that grew around them. Billy repeatedly said, there would have been no Billy Graham as the world knew him without Ruth, and that statement carried the full weight of everything she had absorbed so that he could keep going. The strength of that partnership made the global work possible, and the same strength carried the private costs that accumulated across the decades until the bodies themselves began to slow under the weight of the years. The bodies that slowed under the weight of years. Ruth's physical decline began with the fall from a tree in 1974 while she was testing a swing she had made for the grandchildren. The injury led to progressive degenerative osteoarthritis of the back and neck and chronic pain that never fully left her. In 1995, she suffered spinal meningitis, and from the late 1990s, she was largely bedridden or wheelchair-bound and could no longer travel with Billy the way she once had. In her final months, pneumonia settled in and layered itself on top of everything else until the feeding tube became necessary to keep her at home. The decision to let that tube go when it dislodged was consistent with the independence she had shown her entire life. Billy's own health problems intensified through the 1990s with the Parkinson's, like symptoms later linked to hydrocephalus and treated with a shunt, along with prostate cancer, macular degeneration, progressive, loss of vision and hearing balance issues, and repeated respiratory problems including pneumonia. He continued major crusades into the early 2000s, but the final large New York event in 2005 marked the effective end of his public preaching life. The years that followed were spent quietly at the mountain home under care, while the world continued to speak of him in the past tense, even while he was still alive. Both of them died at home after prolonged but managed age-related decline. Ruth was surrounded by Billy and all 5 children in a room filled with scripture and song. Billy was attended only by a nurse in a house that had grown accustomed to silence. Primary contemporary reporting from the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association major news outlets and family statements consistently describe peaceful passings free of the kind of crisis that sensational stories sometimes invent. No evidence supports claims of an especially violent or scandal-driven end. The deeper weight lay in the years of separation, the family strains, the private loneliness, and the quiet grief that preceded those final hours. The public story celebrated the partnership and the global reach that touched millions. The private story carried the accumulated cost of a calling that asked so much of the people who lived closest to it, and that left its marks in the silence of a mountain house and in the complicated love the children still carried. The endings of Billy and Ruth Graham were not the dramatic collapses that certain titles try to create. They were the final accounting of a life lived in the tension between a vast public work and the private relationships that made that work possible. The isolation of Billy's last morning, the depression that followed Ruth's death, the family tensions around the burial, and the decades of absence all form part of the same longer story about what a life of public faith can require from the people who share the ordinary rooms and the ordinary days. What do you think about the private costs that can accumulate behind a public life of faith and calling? Share your thoughts in the comments below.